The dense jungle was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. The huntress moved silently, her eyes scanning the ground for tracks. She had been following her prey for days, and the trail was fresh. Her heart pounded with excitement. This was what she lived for, the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of a successful capture. She crouched low, her fingers brushing against a broken twig. The human was close. She could feel it. Her lips curled into a smirk. This one had been clever, but no one could outrun her for long. As she crept forward, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She froze, her instincts screaming at her to be still. Something was wrong. The jungle had gone eerily quiet. Even the insects had stopped chirping. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of her unease. Then she heard it, a low, guttural growl behind her. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head, her hand tightening around the hilt of her knife. Two glowing eyes stared back at her from the shadows. The huntress had always been a master of her craft. She had tracked targets through deserts, mountains, and frozen tundras. But this jungle was different. It felt alive, as if it were watching her every move. The air was thick with humidity, and the dense canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight, casting everything in a dim, greenish glow. She had been hired by a shadowy organization known only as the Syndicate. They had given her a simple mission: find the human and bring him back alive. No questions asked. The reward was substantial, enough to make her ignore the red flags. She didn't know why they wanted him, and she didn't care. That was the code she lived by: complete the job, collect the payment, and move on. But now, as she stood in the heart of the jungle, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. The Syndicate had provided her with minimal information, just a name, a photo, and a general location. The man she was hunting was a scientist, they said. A rogue element who had stolen valuable research. The huntress had accepted the job without hesitation. She had faced dangerous targets before, and a scientist didn't seem like much of a challenge. But the jungle was testing her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The terrain was treacherous, with hidden pitfalls and venomous creatures lurking in every shadow. And then there were the sounds, strange, unnatural noises that didn't belong in any jungle she had ever encountered. As she pressed forward, she found more signs of her prey. A discarded water bottle, a torn piece of fabric caught on a thorny vine. The scientist was clearly in a hurry, but he was also careless. That made her job easier. But the unease in her gut grew stronger with every step. She had been in the jungle for 3 days now, and the closer she got to her target, the more she felt like she was being watched. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia. But then she started noticing things: footprints that were too large to belong to any animal she knew, claw marks on trees that were fresh and deep. She tried to push the thoughts aside. Her focus needed to be on the mission. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the jungle floor, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she was no longer the hunter. Something was out there. Something far more dangerous than her prey. The scientist stumbled through the jungle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He had been running for days, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until he was sure he was safe. His name was Dr. Arjun Patel, though he hadn't introduced himself to anyone in weeks. He had been a respected researcher, working for a biotech company on cutting-edge genetic engineering projects. But everything changed when he discovered the truth about their experiments. The company, backed by the Syndicate, had been using the jungle as a testing ground for genetically engineered predators. These creatures were designed to be the ultimate hunters: fast, intelligent, and nearly indestructible. The goal was to sell them to the highest bidder, whether that was a government, a private military, or a criminal organization. Arjun had tried to expose the truth, but he was quickly silenced. His colleagues turned against him, and he was framed for stealing research. Now, he was a fugitive, hunted by both the syndicate and the very creatures he had helped create. He had managed to escape the lab, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. The jungle was his only hope. If he could reach the nearest town, he could contact someone who would listen. Someone who could stop the syndicate before it was too late. But the jungle was no safe haven. The predators were out there, stalking him. He had seen them, hulking, shadowy figures with glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws. They moved silently, almost like ghosts, and they were always one step behind him. Arjun paused to catch his breath, leaning against a tree. His legs felt like they were about to give out, but he couldn't afford to rest. He had to keep moving. As he pushed himself forward, he heard a rustling in the bushes ahead. His heart skipped a beat. Was it one of the predators? Or something else? He crouched low, his eyes scanning the area. The rustling grew louder, and then he saw her, the huntress. She was tall and lean, with sharp features and a determined look in her eyes. She moved with the grace of a predator, her every step calculated and precise. Arjun's stomach churned. He had heard stories about her. She was one of the syndicate's best hunters, known for never failing a mission. If she had been sent after him, his chances of survival were slim. But as he watched her, he noticed something strange. She seemed uneasy. Her eyes darted around, as if she were searching for something. Or someone. Arjun's mind raced. Maybe she wasn't the only one hunting him. Maybe she was in danger too. He hesitated, torn between running and trying to reason with her. But before he could decide, a low growl echoed through the jungle. The huntress froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her knife. Arjun's blood ran cold. The predators had found them. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the trees like a warning. The huntress spun around, her knife gleaming in the dim light. Her eyes locked onto the source of the sound, a pair of glowing eyes emerging from the shadows. Arjun's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The predator stepped into the open, revealing its monstrous form. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a massive, wolf-like creature with sleek, black fur and razor-sharp claws. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intelligence, and its lips curled back to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. The huntress didn't hesitate. She lunged at the creature, her knife aimed at its throat. But the predator was faster. It dodged her attack with ease, swiping at her with its claws. She barely managed to leap out of the way, landing in a crouch a few feet away. Arjun watched in horror as the two clashed. The huntress was skilled, her movements fluid and precise, but the predator was stronger and faster. It was clear that she was outmatched. "Run!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Arjun blinked, startled. Was she talking to him? "I said run, you idiot," she yelled again, dodging another swipe from the predator. This time, Arjun didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the fight, snarls, growls, and the clash of metal against claws. He didn't know why the huntress had told him to run. Maybe she was buying herself time. Or maybe she realized that they were both in over their heads. Either way, he wasn't going to waste the opportunity. As he ran, his mind raced. He couldn't keep running forever. The jungle was vast, and the predators were everywhere. He needed a plan. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He remembered a cave he had passed earlier, a small, hidden opening in the side of a rocky hill. It might be enough to hide him, at least for a little while. He changed direction, pushing through the dense foliage. The sounds of the fight grew fainter, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. When he finally reached the cave, he ducked inside, his chest heaving. It was dark and damp, but it was safe. For now. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The Huntress, the Predator, the Syndicate, it was all too much. But as he sat there, a realization dawned on him. The Huntress had saved his life. She could have let the Predator kill him, but she hadn't. Why? Before he could ponder the question further, he heard footsteps outside the cave. His heart leapt into his throat. Had the Predator followed him? He held his breath, listening intently. The footsteps grew closer, and then a shadow appeared at the entrance of the cave. It was the Huntress. She was battered and bruised, her clothes torn and bloodied, but she was alive. She stepped into the cave, her eyes scanning the darkness until they landed on Arjun. "You're lucky I'm good at my job," she said, her voice cold but tinged with exhaustion. Arjun stared at her, unsure of what to say. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Why did you save me?" The Huntress didn't answer right away. She leaned against the wall, her knife still clutched in her hand. After a long moment, she said, "Because I'm starting to think we're on the same side." The cave was silent except for the sound of their breathing. The Huntress sat across from Arjun, her sharp eyes studying him. She looked exhausted but alert, her knife resting on her lap. Arjun could feel the weight of her gaze, and it made him uneasy. "Who are you?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. Arjun hesitated. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he didn't have much of a choice. "My name is Dr. Arjun Patel," he said. "I used to work for the Syndicate. But not anymore." The Huntress raised an eyebrow. "What did you do to make them send someone like me after you?" Arjun took a deep breath. "I found out what they're really doing. They're not just a biotech company. They're creating monsters, genetically engineered predators designed to hunt and kill. This jungle is their testing ground. And I tried to stop them." The Huntress frowned. "Why would they create something like that?" "Money," Arjun said bitterly. "Power. They want to sell these creatures to the highest bidder. Governments, militaries, criminals, it doesn't matter to them. As long as they get paid." The Huntress was silent for a moment, processing his words. Then she said, "And you? Why did you get involved?" Arjun looked down at his hands. "I thought I was doing something good. I believed in the science, in the potential to help people. But when I realized what they were really doing, I couldn't stay silent. I tried to expose them, but they framed me. Now, they want me dead." The Huntress leaned back, her expression unreadable. "So, you're not just a target. You're a threat." Arjun nodded. "And so are you, now that you've helped me." The Huntress smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Great. Just what I needed." Arjun studied her carefully. "Why did you save me back there? You could have let that thing kill me." The Huntress sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Let's just say I've been having doubts about the Syndicate for a while now. They've always been secretive, but this is something else. I didn't sign up to hunt monsters. Or to be hunted by them." Arjun felt a glimmer of hope. "So, you'll help me?" The Huntress gave him a hard look. "Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm not exactly a fan of playing the hero. But if what you're saying is true, then we're both in danger. And right now, our best chance of survival is to work together." Arjun nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said, standing up. "We're not out of this jungle. And those things are still out there." As if on cue, a low growl echoed from outside the cave. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the entrance. The Huntress grabbed her knife, her body tense. "Stay behind me," she whispered. Arjun nodded, his heart racing. He could see movement in the shadows outside, a pair of glowing eyes, then another. The predators had found them. The huntress tightened her grip on her knife. When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Arjun swallowed hard. What about you? She glanced at him, a faint smirk on her lips. I'll be right behind you. Before he could respond, the predators lunged. The predators burst into the cave with terrifying speed, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. The huntress moved like lightning, meeting the first creature head-on. Her knife slashed through the air, striking its shoulder and forcing it back with a snarl. Run, she shouted, her voice sharp and commanding. Arjun didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted deeper into the cave, his heart pounding in his chest. The narrow passage twisted and turned, the walls closing in around him. He could hear the sounds of the fight behind him, snarls, growls, and the clash of metal against claws. The cave eventually opened into a larger chamber, dimly lit by shafts of moonlight filtering through cracks in the ceiling. Arjun skidded to a halt, his eyes scanning the room for an exit. There was another passage on the far side, but it was blocked by a pile of rocks. Panic surged through him. He was trapped. Before he could think of a plan, the huntress appeared at the entrance of the chamber, her knife in hand. She was breathing heavily, her clothes torn and bloodied, but she was alive. Move, she barked, rushing toward him. Arjun stepped aside just as she reached the pile of rocks. She began pulling at them with surprising strength, her muscles straining as she worked to clear the path. Help me, she snapped. Arjun jumped into action, grabbing rocks and tossing them aside. The sounds of the predators grew louder, echoing through the cave. They were coming. Finally, they cleared enough space to squeeze through the passage. The huntress shoved Arjun forward, following close behind. The narrow tunnel led them outside, where the jungle stretched out before them, dark and foreboding. Keep moving, the huntress said, her voice low and urgent. They ran through the jungle, the predators hot on their trail. The huntress led the way, her movements swift and precise. She seemed to know exactly where to go, weaving through the trees and underbrush with ease. Arjun struggled to keep up, his legs burning with exhaustion. He had been running for days, and his body was reaching its limit. But he couldn't stop. Not now. As they ran, the huntress glanced back at him. Stay close. If we get separated, you're dead. Arjun nodded, too out of breath to respond. The jungle seemed to grow darker as they pressed on, the canopy above blocking out the moonlight. The sounds of the predators grew fainter, but neither of them dared to slow down. Finally, the huntress came to a stop near a small stream. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the area. We'll rest here for a few minutes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But we can't stay long. Arjun collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. He cupped his hands in the stream, drinking deeply. The water was cold and refreshing, but it did little to ease his fear. The huntress sat beside him, her knife resting on her lap. She kept her eyes on the jungle, her body tense and ready. How did you know about that cave? Arjun asked after a moment. The huntress shrugged. I've been in this jungle before. The syndicate sends me here for training sometimes. I know a few hiding spots. Arjun frowned. Training? For what? She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For jobs like this. Arjun didn't press further. He could tell she wasn't in the mood to talk. As they sat in silence, the jungle seemed to close in around them. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made Arjun's heart skip a beat. Finally, the huntress stood up. We need to keep moving. We're not safe here. Arjun nodded, forcing himself to his feet. His body ached, but he knew she was right. As they set off again, the huntress turned to him. "If we're going to survive this, you need to trust me. No questions, no hesitation. Understand?" Arjun met her gaze and nodded. "I understand." For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this jungle alive. The jungle grew denser as they moved, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The huntress led the way, her movements swift and deliberate. Arjun followed close behind, his eyes darting around nervously. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made his heart race. They had been walking for hours, the silence between them heavy and unbroken. Arjun wanted to ask her more questions, about the syndicate, about her past, about what they were going to do next, but he didn't dare. She had made it clear that trust was fragile, and he wasn't willing to risk it. Finally, the huntress came to a stop near a rocky outcrop. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the area. "We'll rest here for a bit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But keep your guard up." Arjun nodded, sinking to the ground. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and his head was spinning. He leaned against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment. The huntress sat a few feet away, her knife resting on her lap. She kept her eyes on the jungle, her body tense and ready. After a long silence, Arjun spoke. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" The huntress didn't look at him. "If we're smart, and if we're lucky." Arjun frowned. "And if we're not?" She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Then we die." Arjun swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but he couldn't find the words. As they sat in silence, the jungle seemed to close in around them. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made Arjun's heart skip a beat. Finally, the huntress stood up. "We need to keep moving. We're not safe here." Arjun nodded, forcing himself to his feet. His body ached, but he knew she was right. They set off again, the huntress leading the way. As they walked, Arjun couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The huntress seemed different. Distant. Like she was hiding something. He tried to push the thought aside, but it nagged at him. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "What aren't you telling me?" he asked, his voice trembling. The huntress stopped in her tracks, her back stiff. She didn't turn around. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cold. Arjun took a deep breath. "You've been acting strange ever since we left the cave. Like you're keeping something from me. What is it?" The huntress was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to face him, her eyes hard. "You're right," she said. "I am keeping something from you." Arjun's heart sank. "What is it?" The huntress hesitated, her grip tightening on her knife. "The syndicate didn't just send me to capture you. They sent me to kill you." Arjun stared at her, his mind reeling. "What?" "They told me you were a threat," she continued, her voice steady. "That you had stolen their research and needed to be eliminated. But now, I'm not so sure." Arjun took a step back, his heart pounding. "So, what are you saying? Are you going to kill me?" The huntress shook her head. "No. Not anymore. But I need to know the truth. All of it." Arjun hesitated, his mind racing. He had trusted her, but now he wasn't sure if he could. Before he could respond, a low growl echoed through the jungle. Both of them froze, their eyes darting around. The predators had found them again. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the trees like a thunderclap. The huntress and Arjun stood back to back, their eyes scanning the shadows. The predators were close, too close. "Stay behind me," the huntress said, her voice low and steady. Arjun nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see movement in the darkness, glowing eyes, shifting shapes. The predators were circling them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The huntress tightened her grip on her knife, her body tense and ready. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back." Arjun swallowed hard. "What about you?" She glanced at him, a faint smirk on her lips. "I'll be right behind you." Before he could respond, the predators lunged. The huntress moved like a whirlwind, her knife flashing in the dim light. She struck the first predator with precision, slicing through its shoulder and forcing it back with a snarl. But there were too many of them. They came from all sides, their claws slashing through the air. Arjun stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and watch her fight alone. He grabbed a large stick from the ground, holding it like a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The huntress glanced at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing?" "Helping you," Arjun said, his voice trembling but determined. She shook her head. "You'll get yourself killed." Before she could say more, another predator lunged at her. She dodged its attack, but it left her open to another. Arjun swung the stick with all his strength, hitting the creature in the side. It let out a yelp and retreated, but only for a moment. The huntress gave him a quick nod, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Stay close." They fought side by side, their movements clumsy but coordinated. The huntress took down one predator after another, her knife a blur of motion. Arjun did his best to keep the creatures at bay, using the stick to fend them off. But the predators were relentless. They kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. The huntress was tiring, her movements slowing. Arjun could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the strain on her face. "We can't keep this up," he said, his voice desperate. The huntress nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to retreat. Follow me." She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a narrow path through the trees. They ran as fast as they could, the predators hot on their heels. The path led them to a rocky cliff, the ground dropping away into a steep ravine. The huntress skidded to a halt, her eyes scanning the area. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow ledge that ran along the side of the cliff. "We can cross there." Arjun hesitated, his stomach churning. The ledge was barely wide enough to stand on, and the drop was deadly. But they didn't have a choice. The huntress went first, her movements sure and steady. Arjun followed, his heart in his throat. He pressed himself against the cliff, his hands trembling as he inched along the ledge. The predators reached the edge of the cliff, their glowing eyes fixed on them. They snarled and snapped, but they didn't follow. Arjun let out a shaky breath. "They're not coming after us." The huntress shook her head. "They're smart. They know we're trapped." They continued along the ledge, the ravine stretching out below them. The huntress led the way, her eyes focused on the path ahead. Finally, they reached the other side, the ground leveling out into a small clearing. The huntress collapsed onto the ground, her chest heaving. Arjun sank down beside her, his legs giving out. They were both battered and bruised, but they were alive. For now. The clearing was quiet, the sounds of the jungle distant and muted. The huntress and Arjun sat in silence, their bodies aching and their minds racing. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. Arjun glanced at the huntress, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She looked different now, softer, somehow. The cold, calculating edge she had carried since they met was gone, replaced by a weariness that mirrored his own. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The huntress didn't answer right away. She stared at the ground, her knife resting loosely in her hand. Finally, she said, "We keep moving. We're not safe here." Arjun nodded, though his body protested at the thought of getting up. Do you think we've lost them? For now, she said. But they'll find us again. They always do. Arjun swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had come so far, survived so much, but the end still felt out of reach. What's the point of all this? Running, fighting, just to die in the end? The huntress looked at him, her eyes sharp. The point is to survive. As long as we're alive, there's hope. Arjun frowned. Hope for what? Even if we make it out of this jungle, the syndicate will never stop hunting us. The huntress hesitated, her gaze drifting to the horizon. Maybe. But we're not the only ones who know the truth now. If we can get the evidence out, if we can expose what they're doing, we might have a chance. Arjun's heart skipped a beat. You mean the research I stole? She nodded. It's the only thing that can stop them. But we have to be smart about it. We can't just run blindly. We need a plan. Arjun sat up straighter, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. What kind of plan? The huntress thought for a moment, then said, there's a town about a day's journey from here. If we can make it there, we can find someone who can help us, someone who's not afraid to stand up to the syndicate. Arjun nodded, though the thought of another day in the jungle made his stomach churn. And then what? Then we fight, she said, her voice firm. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone they've hurt. For everyone they'll hurt if we don't stop them. Arjun stared at her, a newfound respect blooming in his chest. She wasn't just a hunter anymore. She was something more. You're different, he said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. How so? You're not just doing this for yourself anymore, he said. You're doing it for something bigger. The huntress looked away, her expression unreadable. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of running. Arjun didn't press further. He could see the weight of her past in her eyes, the scars that went deeper than the ones on her skin. They sat in silence for a while, the jungle around them alive with the sounds of the night. Finally, the huntress stood up, her movements slow but deliberate. We should get moving, she said, holding out a hand to Arjun. He took it, letting her pull him to his feet. His legs wobbled, but he steadied himself, determination hardening in his chest. As they set off again, the huntress leading the way, Arjun felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was overshadowed by something else, hope. They walked through the night, the jungle slowly giving way to open plains. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and in the distance, Arjun could see the faint outline of buildings. The town. The huntress stopped, turning to face him. This is it. Once we go in there, there's no turning back. Arjun nodded, his heart pounding. I'm ready. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. Let's finish this. As they walked toward the town, side by side, Arjun felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. They had survived the jungle, the predators, and their own doubts. Now, it was time to fight for something bigger than themselves. And no matter what happened, he knew one thing for certain, they wouldn't go down without a fight.